All right, let's pick up right where we left off. So the first thing to look at is how did soldiers experience the war? So when it comes to both the Union and Confederate soldiers, the average age of the soldier is going to be age 25. And again, for each side, soldiers are only going to carry what was absolutely needed to fight and survive the elements during war. So the first thing we're going to need is a uniform. So we've got our Union soldiers all decked out in blue, and our Confederate soldiers all decked out in gray. And so with this, we've got our uniform, we've got our bayonets, we've got our rifle muskets, we've got our canteens. We've only got the basic necessities. We can begin to look into the Union soldiers being better fed compared to Confederates, and the Confederacy is really going to have to scavenge for food just because the Union was more industrial, and so as a result, the Union is able to mass produce food and supplies to get out to their soldiers in the front lines. We can also look into medical care and how medical care was good for the time and for the knowledge that was obtained by the 1860s. However, we do see a massive chunk of casualties that do come from disease and from wounds. And if we focus specifically on Union casualties, we can look into 360,000 Union casualties, and of this 360,000, 43,000 comes from wounds and 224,000 comes from disease. We can also look into a little bit more similarities between Union and Confederacy, and that both sides were motivated by strong patriotism. However, the patriotism is going to look different for each side, and that the Confederacy believed that they were being invaded by Union forces, and so they were really fighting for maintaining the Confederacy and for succeeding in a second War of Independence. The Union, as a counter-reaction, was really fighting for preserving the Union. So looking into, did soldiers ever abandon their post? And if they did, what was the result or the punishment of that action? So we've got a term called desertion, which is the soldier abandoning a duty or a post. We've got 1 in 7 Confederate soldiers and 1 in 10 Union soldiers who will desert their post. And this would be for a range of reasons. And so we've got authorities from both sides who are going to try to lure deserters back to their post, just in that they need all the manpower they can get in securing victory for their side. However, punishment is going to be a little bit inconsistent. We can also look into prisoners of war, or POWs, and that at the beginning of the war, there was a more even exchange between Union and Confederate POWs, but by 1863, the Union is stopping this exchange just because they believe the Confederacy is benefiting more from POWs. And that, of course, you don't want your soldiers to be captured and obtained in a POW camp. However, the Union is already starting off with more soldiers. And so if the Confederacy can capture and obtain these soldiers, then they're taking away that number and that benefit from the Union. And so in the end, each side is going to have thousands of captives in POW camps, and there's going to be a high mortality rate within these camps due to malnutrition and disease. And if we take a look at the graph over here, we've got our blue representing the Union, we've got our gray representing the Confederates, and we've got our black representing the death. And so if we come and look over at the blue, these are our Union soldiers, again, captured and obtained in southern POW camps. And we've got a high toll of death among them just because a lot of them are starving or they're malnourished. And this is because the Confederacy was having a hard time supplying their own soldiers with food. And so add on top of that thousands of Union POWs, there's just no way you're going to be able to feed that number of people. So looking into the Confederate President Davis as a leader, as mentioned in the last video, Davis did have some military experience from the Mexican War, and he was a big advocate of higher tariffs on cotton and slaves just because if he can produce and sell high-tax cotton to Europeans, he's able to use this money for weapons and supplies for his troops. He's going to have the support from the majority of his Confederate Congress. However, he's not a super effective communicator, which is going to result in a lack of organization, a lack of mobilization, and even more substantially, no legislative bills are going to be passed during this time, no substantial bills. What Davis will have to focus on, however, is preserving state rights, and that the South seceded from the Union because states' rights were not being recognized in terms of slavery. And so because of this, Davis knew that he would have a very, very unsuccessful outcome if he didn't focus on states' rights and keeping the states happy. So looking into how did the Confederacy raise money for war? and we'll get into this graph in just a second. So the Union blockade made selling cotton difficult, just in that in blocking off the ports, there's no way that you can get Europeans to buy your cottons in exchange for weapons. There's also few gold reserves, and taxing the people was unpopular. And so what Davis decides to do instead is to borrow and print more money, which of course is going to lead to massive inflation and debt. So what he tries to do to counteract this is he passes the Impressment Act, which is seizing goods to support the front lines. Another thing that Davis will do is pass the Taxation in Kind Act, which is going to collect 10% of farmer produce to feed the troops. And so, talking a little bit more about money, if we go and take a look at the graph, we've got the darkest gray representing tax revenues. Maybe we'll try throwing some bonds in there, which is the gray color. And even better, let's just print more money. And so that's really what the Confederacy is going to rely on, as we see represented by the white. However, this is coming with some major consequences, in that you can't just print more money, because in doing that, you're devaluing the money that is already circulating the system. So looking into, could the Confederate Army have been saved? The first thing being that Davis could have supervised the railroad more effectively, and that there was a lot of shortages that led to the collapse of the railroad, and that a lot of raw materials were being abandoned at depots. And so even materials that we did have, they weren't able to get to the troops. Another thing is that cotton could have been used more effectively, and that at the beginning of the war, Davis put a pause on cotton production to focus more on food. Another good thing that could come on pausing cotton in focus of food is that Davis hoped to create a cotton scarcity, which would then later promote foreign trade. And that if he pauses on cotton, it kind of freaks Europe out for a little bit, and when the South did decide to start producing cotton again, Europeans would come begging back to the South, and hopefully the South would then be able to sell to the Europeans at a higher rate. Another thing that Davis could have arguably done was have a better control on blockade runners. And so what would happen is any European ships who could get into southern harbors, they were required by Davis to have a certain amount of goods that were dedicated for military effort. And so what the Europeans ended up doing after enough time is they started sending over luxury goods. So because they had these luxuries and not necessities that really bogged down the South. Another thing, Davis could have arguably used the slaves more effectively, in that instead of having the slaves remain at home on the plantations, he could have had them out doing more labor to help sustain the troops. So looking into some of the social impacts of the war, and this is going to be for both sides, in that wives of the soldiers began working jobs that were typically reserved for men. And one of these jobs is going to be nurses. So prior to the Civil War, nursing was really a job that was designated toward men. We'll also see that Confederate women are going to run plantations, and on the plantations, we don't have any evidence of slave revolts, but we do see that slaves are fleeing plantations. And another big impact is that many regiments are coming from the same neighborhood, and so if we have an entire regiment that is wiped out in the war, then entire neighborhoods are just destroyed. So looking into Lincoln and how he was doing as a leader. So as mentioned in the previous video, Lincoln had no military experience. He had very little administrative experience, but when he does obtain office, he focuses a lot on military over political goals, and that the main thing and the first thing to focus on is to preserve the Union and to get the South back into the United States. He has major support from Congress just because the majority of Congress is Republican, and again, just focusing on industrialization. Looking into how is the Union raising money for war, and again, we'll get back to this map in just a bit. So unlike the Confederacy, the Union is going to establish a treasury of gold reserve, and the people are going to be encouraged to invest to bring down debt. And so we're not just printing out more money, we're getting the people involved. And so another big way that this is going to be enacted is we've got the first income tax that goes into effect. And with this, we've got about a 3% tax on every $800 that is spent. So we've got this as a start. And then afterwards, we've got the Internal Revenue Act, which is going to put a tax on everything. So again, getting the people's money back into the economy to help sustain and bring down our debt. Another big thing Lincoln will do is enact the Legal Tender Act, which is going to issue 150 million paper currency into the economy that is not redeemable by gold or silver. And so, yes, we are having money that is being printed, but we're not just printing money and then leaving it at that. And so if we go and look over at our map, we've got tax revenue, which is represented as the darkest color, and then we have our bonds as the next color, and then we have some money that we're printing off as well. But again, as time goes forward, we're really relying on taxes and bonds. So looking into the economic impact of the war for the Union. So we have some economic legislation that is also passed. However, it's at some Democratic opposition. The first act being passed being the Homestead Act, which gives 160 free acres of land in the West to any man who works on the land for 5 years. We also see higher tariffs introduced, and this is to create a protection against foreign competition. And we even see railroad subsidies. And with this, we have the beginning of the production of the Transcontinental Railroad that will bring us from the East Coast all the way over to the West Coast. So looking into some of our generals during the war, we've got our Major General for the Confederacy, General of the Army of Virginia, Robert E. Lee. He's really going to focus on the offense in order to gain the initiative over his enemy. And he does this just because he believes that retreating and really being on the defense is going to lead to more sieges during the war. And so with that, you always want to attack. He's for a more conventional approach over guerrilla fighting, just in that if you're relying solely on guerrilla warfare, you're looking weaker, it's not really as well respected, especially when it comes to getting the Europeans involved in the war, which was the hope of Robert E. Lee. He's going to, again, want to defend Virginia just because Richmond, Virginia is the capital of the Confederacy. And again, a major problem of the Confederate forces is that they're just going to be under-resourced. Looking into two major Union generals, we've got, of course, the Union commander, Ulysses S. Grant. He has a total war strategy, which is really saying that he's willing to go to any means to secure victory for the Union. He's been described as persistent and not easily excited. And a good quote that represents Grant as a leader is that you find out where your enemy is as soon as you can, you strike as hard as you can, and you keep moving forward. And next general that we have is General William T. Sherman, shown here. Sherman is really important because he captures Atlanta, and he also leads marches through Georgia and the Carolinas. And again, for the Union, they're going to be more successful just because they're better equipped and they have larger numbers compared to the Confederacy. And we will end there.